Darfur in Sudan conjures up a jumble of half-forgotten news headlines, from famine and humanitarian disaster to war, while the actions of the genocidal Janjaweed militia have slipped into the realms of nightmares. The UN peacekeeping missions and the focus of the international media has also gone, with the charity wristbands that called on the world to save Darfur. But can anyone remember from what? It's over 2 years since nationwide peaceful protests ended the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. Sudan has begun a fragile democratic transition. The government devalued the currency to fight smuggling and corruption, but are now battling spiralling economic costs, with inflation running at more than 200% a year. Local militia attacks are still common, while 2 million internally displaced people shelter in makeshift camps. Their numbers are being joined by refugees fleeing Tigray across the border in Ethiopia. Meanwhile, the COVID crisis struck and international aid budgets have been drastically reduced. With so many huge priorities to address in Sudan, it will be a long time before the impact of change will be felt in rural communities in Darfur, where many villages lack the basic essentials of life. No water, no electricity, nor healthcare for humans or animals, with virtually no infrastructure of any kinds, even roads. However, for 20 years, a small British charity, Kids for Kids, led by the indomitable Patricia Parker OBE, has prevailed in North Darfur to try and improve the basic living standards for ordinary people trying to survive in rural villages with a sustainable development model to help them to survive and help themselves. In fact, Kids for Kids has helped 550,000 people in 106 villages and provided over 120,000 goats. So how did a chance meeting on a dusty road 20 years ago lead to helping over 500,000 people?
As soon as you get to Darfur, you realise that it's something different. It's something that the hardship, the total neglect in this day and age is beyond it. And it was coming across a little 9-year-old in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the deserts, and realising that his life was simply collecting water, walking and walking and walking. And he walked for 7 hours to reach a hand pump and then had to carry the jerry can home and then turn around and do it again and again and again. And then I realised that his mother was absolutely moving heaven and earth to guard 3 little goats because they were so important to her. When the harvests fail, so goats and animals become even more important. And she was guarding these goats. And I realised, actually, you needed goats. And so we went to the village. And you can't just have animals if you haven't got veterinary care. Very, very basic stuff. And no veterinary care. So it was obvious you had to provide veterinary care. And then as we sat and talked, we then talked to the women, and of course, no healthcare. And you've got to start at birth. That's where you start, isn't it? And so it was obvious that you needed help in the village. And my first thought was, well, we could get from that. I was only thinking one village at a time, one ghost at a time, if you like, that could we train, I thought 2, because if you just trained one midwife, something might happen or whatever, she would need reinforcements. So you must train 2 in a village. So I got the money to build a midwife training school in Al Fasher. So we trained 40 every 14 months or something. We've been doing that for 20 years.
The Kids for Kids fundraising motto is one goat at a time.
One of the most incredible things that it made me think things would work in Darfur was right at the start when I said, I worked out how many goats would be practical. You know, if you have 5, 1 can die, but you've still got some. And how many, after 2 years, how quickly could you build the flock? You need to work it out. And I said to the villagers, well, look, if we're providing 5 nanny goats to the poorest families, isn't this going to cause jealousy? When you think of the amount of money that is. And I was stunned at the answer. They said, oh no, if you support the poorer families, you're taking the burden of supporting them off us. Now that was what I find so humbling. In poor communities, people do that. They care for their neighbours.
The sustainable business model that Patricia developed for Kids for Kids enables villagers to help themselves by providing the poorest 15% of a village a loan of 6 goats. As the flock grows, the next family is given 6 goats from it to start the process again.
If I provided, not a mobile phone, if I provided, pencils, these things, markers, and I have lots of these, and I turn up in a village and I sit down and I say to people, what would you like? Oh, this is what we really want, because they know that that's what I'm going to give. So what's much better is to sit with people and say, describe your life. Tell me about your life. Tell me, what do you do in the morning? What's it like? If you can do that and spend time actually living with a community, you really will find out a lot more. And people need their dignity. And to be handed things is, you lose your dignity. To have to be grateful seems awful when you're grateful for the basics of life. So we needed to do things that gave people dignity, that we weren't intruding. We were providing them with basics, which they have a right to, and then help them, train them to make the most of what we were trying to help them with. So that was the principle. But then there was also the practical thought that with the government then, particularly then Bashir, there was a strong chance that at any minute we might be stopped. They might get rid of Kids for Kids. And so I thought what we must do is make every single thing we do survivable without me.
A donation of £50 buys a single healthy goat, while £300 gets a family started with their own flock. As Patricia has said in the past, she does not believe in charity, but empowering, particularly women, to take charge of their own lives long term.
One thing that I would love to be able to do is to step back from the active management of Kids for Kids, so that I could go and talk to all the wonderful youngsters who are studying international development and talk to them about the realities of sustainable development. When people have a very rudimentary education, and sometimes none at all, 98% of the women in Darfur can't read and write. How can you expect them to take in training when they go to a training course and then they go back to their village? It won't happen. You've got to follow it up. You've got to not just follow it up once, you've got to follow it up over a couple of years to make sure that they understand, how to put into practice what it is you're trying to show them. Now, something else I've done is we actually have what I call a project implementation manual, is that it actually is written for the village leaders so that they can see, and we agree it beforehand, what they can expect from us and what we expect from them. And they have to sign every single page of it to show that they've really taken this in. It doesn't always work. Often there are gaps. Often we learn from mistakes and so on. But that is something that actually the principles of what we do, listening to the communities, finding out what they say will help, what will work, what won't work, actually can be put into practice across the whole of the Third World.
Operating in Darfur under a dictatorship has had its own set of difficulties. Patricia and her son, British diplomat Alistair King-Smith, were kidnapped by the Janjaweed militia in 2005. Later, Patricia was refused visa entry to Darfur for a period of 10 years. However, Kids for Kids survived, as Patricia maintained a working relationship with the authorities.
I think because of the way I've done this, they haven't stopped me at the worst. And in fact, what was lovely, the governor of North Darfur for several years actually gave out goats during Ramadan. They hand out, the amounts during Ramadan, handed out goats for a number of years while he was in authority, even though I know he did some, terrible things. But handed out goats, during Ramadan to people because he realized, and he actually came to one of my conferences, my workshops in Darfur, and said, it was quite surprising. He said, Patricia, do you realize you're improving the IQ of the children in Darfur? And I laughed. I thought, what does he mean? But actually, if you think of it, protein is absolutely essential for the healthy growth of a child. If the lack of protein, and that's what's happening right now, the lack of protein means bones, teeth, nails, and brain cells are compromised. And if you provide goat's milk, actually, you're improving the IQ of those children.
Goats need support too, so Kids for Kids developed a vet training programme.
Before we get the goats into the village, we train the people on how to look after them. There's no point having animals if you need to know which plants are poisonous, all of that sort of thing. We train children's shepherds committees because they go around every Friday morning, the first day of the weekend in Sudan. They go around the whole flock every Friday morning to check the health of the goats. They're wonderful, the children. And we also train 2 paravets. So you've got veterinary care in the village, and we also provide what we call a revolving veterinary fund for drugs, for the veterinary drugs. So you've got the drugs in the village that the animals need.
As part of the Sustainable Development Plan, Kids for Kids also supports water projects, from raising £300 to provide a water cart, £110 for a water tank, or just £18 for 2 jerry cans. Ultimately, the goal is to raise £6,500 for a village hand pump, so that children no longer have to walk for miles to provide water for the family. Other than goats and water, Kids for Kids also raises funds for lots of other needs, including chickens, fruit trees and donkeys.
3 chickens and a rooster are beyond imaginings for particularly the frail elderly, unable to look after goats, even if they could afford them. To have chickens, to have eggs, real eggs gives you proteins. You think of that. And because water is so difficult, we plant fruit trees outside people's huts. And that is magical because when the goats are pregnant, when they've got their little kids, they can shelter under the fruit trees outside the hut. And it helps the goats as well. And of course, it gives shade to a hut that is under that horrendous sun. And we plant community forests around villages. So if people would like to donate 3 drought-resistant trees, those will not only provide shade, not only stabilize the sand, but actually all of them have some sort of extra benefit. So, for example, the neem tree makes a pesticide. So it's a livelihood, an extra livelihood, which of course is an added incentive for people to water the trees. The donkeys of Darfur are absolutely amazing. The little local donkey we're talking about, those are the 4x4 of Darfur. We were very lucky. I met a little blind boy in a village, and he was being late to school every day, and he was being beaten because he was late to school, and his best friend was profoundly deaf. And so I gave the 2 children a donkey. And the little deaf boy led the blind boy to school, and the little blind boy, the next time I went, was 5th in class. How about that? So donkeys, I love the donkeys of Darfur.
So does it work for the people of Darfur?
It's over 500,000 people whose lives, it makes me swell up, whose lives have been changed by Kids for Kids. It will now be 106 villages that we have adopted, where it is totally different. Our villages, as they go on, get bigger. People are moving to our villages from the camps, choosing to. The villages are welcoming them. It's absolutely lovely. Remember, Darfur is the size of France. Important to remember that, because we are not overrunning Darfur with goats. That's a promise. Very few will turn their goats into a living, into a big business. One woman did, and she was terrific. She now has 84 goats. Her husband is working for her. How about this? And what is a real amazing thing, this is kudos. She is so proud that she is paying taxes. Now, isn't that lovely?
Part of Kids for Kids' success is the simplicity of its appeal. Everyone can understand the impact of a goat, planting a shady tree, or providing a water pump. It is this focus that has attracted influential patrons, not just from the diplomatic community, but also artists, writers, and celebrities from the stage and screen.
We've got the most amazing supporters, actually. Quentin Blake, for example, has donated pictures to us and supports us, people like that. What I simply do is to write to people, if I can find an address, and say to them, look, children are in need in Darfur. Would you be happy to help us? And of course, I get a lot of silence. I get a lot of people who turn us down. And in fact, I'd had so many letters turning me down. Years ago, this was. I wanted to ask Joanna Lumley to be a reader at our Christmas concert. You know, the height of ambition. I mean, look how the world loves Joanna. And I got a letter that said, I am sorry. And I thought, oh, I can't face, she's going to turn me down. Of course she. So I didn't read the letter until the evening. And dearest Joanna wrote and said, I am so sorry that I haven't replied earlier. I'd love to come. And when she came to our Christmas concert, well, she heard what we do. And she said, you know, I asked her to be a patron and there was no hesitation. And, you know, the patrons we have are not sleeping patrons. These are patrons who are active.
So what's next for the one goat at a time policy?
This year, I've been able to announce that we're adopting 6 villages. But now I've got to find the goats. And those 2 goats will go to a woman who is, it'll mostly be a woman-headed household who is very poor, has her children. And probably the children won't go to school. She hasn't the money. But she will have 5 goats we will lend her. And those goats will immediately be able to give milk to the children. So they will have protein. So we'll be helping their health. And as the goats multiply, and in good years, the goats will have twins. And do you know, after 2 years, if the mother has looked after them well, she will have a little flock of about 22 goats. She will pass on 5 healthy nanny goats to the next poorest family in the village. Your goats will continue with her, and your babies will be going on, and in another 2 years, to another family. Is there anything more lasting than that?
As the world recovers from the social and economic impacts of COVID-19, it is all the more important not to forget the huge impact that a donation can make to the villagers of Darfur. Please help to keep Kids for Kids going for the next 20 years by donating now.